Hey there, friend. Welcome back to another journey through history's darker corners, where we explore the places and times that make our modern complaints seem almost laughably small. Tonight, we're venturing somewhere that makes medieval dungeons look like luxury resorts, where the very concept of human dignity was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if these deep dives into history help you drift off, and subscribe if you genuinely find comfort in these tales from the past. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something oddly soothing about knowing we're all here together, exploring these distant horrors from the safety of our warm beds. So dim the lights, pull those blankets a little closer, and let's ease into tonight's exploration of why you absolutely, positively, would not survive even 24 hours in Stalin's Gulag system. This isn't just about cold and hunger, though there was plenty of both. This is about a machine designed to break the human spirit so thoroughly that survival itself became a form of collaboration with your own destruction. Picture this. You wake up not to your alarm clock or the gentle morning light filtering through your curtains, but to the sound of a rifle butt hammering against wood, splintering your door at 4 in the morning. The year is 1938, and you're living in a small apartment in Leningrad, or maybe you're a farmer in Ukraine, or perhaps you're an engineer in Moscow. It doesn't really matter who you are or what you've done, because in Stalin's Soviet Union, innocence is not a defense against the machinery of terror. The men who enter your home don't knock, they don't apologize for the hour. They wear the blue caps of the NKVD, and their faces carry the practiced indifference of people who have done this hundreds of times before. They have a warrant, of course. Everything is legal in the Soviet system, even when it's completely arbitrary. The warrant might say you're a counter-revolutionary, or a saboteur, or an enemy of the people. The specific accusation hardly matters because you won't be given a chance to defend yourself in any meaningful way. You have 15 minutes to pack, 15 minutes to gather whatever you think might help you survive what comes next, though you have no idea what that might be. Do you pack warm clothes, books, food, your family photographs? The men with the blue caps watch you with bored efficiency. They've seen this panic before, this desperate attempt to choose what pieces of your life might matter in whatever hell awaits. Your neighbours peer through their curtains, faces pale with the terrible knowledge that they're witnessing something that could just as easily happen to them tomorrow. No one helps. No one protests. No one even makes eye contact. Because in Stalin's Soviet Union, association with the condemned is itself a form of condemnation. Your arrest doesn't just destroy you, it creates a circle of fear around everyone who ever knew you. The ride to the local NKVD building happens in silence. You might try to ask questions, to understand what you're accused of, to explain that there's been some mistake, but the men in the blue caps have heard it all before. Protests of innocence, offers of cooperation, desperate attempts to bargain. None of it matters because you're no longer a person with rights or agency. You're now a unit in the Soviet system of political repression, and that system has its own logic. Its own momentum. The interrogation begins almost immediately. You're placed in a small, windowless room with a single bright light and a table scarred by the fingernails of previous occupants. The interrogator might be polite at first, almost conversational. He offers you tea, asks about your work, your family, your thoughts on Soviet policy. It feels almost normal until you realize that every word you speak is being twisted, catalogued, used to build a case against you that was decided before you ever entered the room. Sleep becomes a weapon used against you. Just as you begin to drift off in your chair, you're shaken awake. The questions resume, the same questions over and over, until you begin to doubt your own memories, your own innocence. Did you really say that thing about Soviet policy? Did you really associate with that person who turned out to be a counter-revolutionary? The interrogator has all the time in the world, and you have no idea how long this will last. Hours become days. days become weeks. You're fed just enough to keep you conscious, but never enough to think clearly. The interrogator changes shifts, but you're never allowed to sleep for more than an hour at a time. Your signature is required on documents you're too exhausted to read, confessions to crimes you can't remember committing, accusations against friends and family members that will be used to justify their own arrests. Finally, mercifully, the interrogation ends. You've signed whatever they wanted you to sign, confessed to whatever they wanted you to confess. You might feel a moment of relief, thinking the worst is over. You couldn't be more wrong, because now comes the sentencing. And in Stalin's Soviet Union, there are really only two types of sentences: death or something that might be worse than death. If you're lucky, you get death. A bullet in the basement of the Lubyanka, quick and final. But most people aren't lucky. Most people get 10 years, or 15, or 25 in the Gulag system. Some get sentences so long, they might as well be death sentences. 10 years without right of correspondence, which everyone knows means execution, or 25 years in distant camps, which means you'll die of exhaustion, cold, or disease long before your sentence is complete. The train journey to the camps is where your real education begins. You're packed into cattle cars with dozens of other prisoners, so tightly that everyone has to stand for hours at a time. There's one bucket for waste, one bucket for water, and no ventilation except for small barred windows near the ceiling. The smell is indescribable, a mixture of human waste, fear, and desperation that seems to seep into your skin and stay there. The other prisoners come from every walk of Soviet life. There's the university professor accused of spreading bourgeois propaganda, the factory worker who made a joke about Stalin, the peasant who hid grain from the state collectors, the party member who expressed doubt about policy. You realize, with growing horror, that the accusations don't need to make sense. The system doesn't require actual crimes, just the appearance of crimes, just enough justification to feed the machine. Some of your fellow prisoners try to maintain hope, talking about appeals, about families who will work for their release, about the possibility that this is all a mistake that will be corrected. Others sit in silence, already understanding what you're beginning to learn, that the Soviet system doesn't make mistakes, it makes choices, and it has chosen to destroy you. The train stops frequently, but never for your comfort. Guards come through the cars, counting prisoners, removing the dead, occasionally dragging out someone who has lost their mind. You learn not to ask questions about where you're going or how long the journey will take. The guards either don't know or don't care, and asking only draws unwanted attention. Days blend into each other as the train carries you deeper into the Soviet wilderness. Through the small windows, you see forests that stretch to the horizon, rivers that flow toward no civilization you can imagine, and eventually, tundra that looks like the surface of an alien world. This is where the Soviet Union puts the people it wants to forget, in places so remote that escape would be virtually impossible, even if you had the strength to attempt it. When the train finally stops, you understand why your sentence specified a particular camp. This isn't just imprisonment, it's exile to the very edge of human civilization. The camp that becomes your new home exists in a place where the winter temperatures regularly drop to -40 degrees, where the summer lasts only a few weeks, and where the nearest town is hundreds of miles away through wilderness that would kill you long before you could reach it. The camp itself is surrounded by multiple layers of barbed wire, with guard towers manned by soldiers who have been told that shooting escaping prisoners is not just permitted, but encouraged. Inside the wire, there are barracks that might have been designed for 50 people, but house 200, workshops where prisoners perform the kind of dangerous manual labor that the Soviet Union doesn't want to pay free workers to do, and administrative buildings where camp officials live in relative comfort while managing their human inventory. Your first lesson in Gulag life is that everything you thought you knew about human nature, about fairness, about survival, is useless here. The camp operates according to a different logic, where your ability to live through another day depends not on your innocence or your worth as a human being, but on your capacity to navigate a system designed to extract every ounce of useful work from your body before discarding you. The hierarchy among prisoners is complex and brutal. At the top are the criminal prisoners, the murderers and thieves who are considered more reliable than political prisoners, because their crimes are personal rather than ideological. They receive better food, easier work assignments, and the tacit support of the guards, who see them as useful tools for maintaining order among the political prisoners. Below the criminals are the various categories of political prisoners, each with their own place in the camp's social structure. Former party members are despised by everyone, seen as traitors who deserve whatever happens to them. Intellectuals are viewed with suspicion by the guards and contempt by the other prisoners. Too soft for the brutal realities of camp life. Peasants and workers fare somewhat better, but only because they're considered less dangerous to Soviet ideology. At the very bottom are the prisoners who have been broken by the system. The ones who have given up any pretense of maintaining their dignity or humanity. They inform on other prisoners for scraps of food, perform the most degrading tasks without complaint, and serve as examples of what happens to people who resist the camp's logic too long. The guards call them goners, and everyone understands that once you join their ranks, you're already dead. Your body just hasn't figured it out yet. Your work assignment determines everything about your life in the camp. If you're sent to the forest to cut trees, you'll spend 12 hours a day in temperatures that can freeze exposed skin in minutes, wielding tools that are deliberately kept dull and inadequate. If you're assigned to the mines, you'll descend into tunnels where cave-ins and gas explosions are routine hazards, where the air is so thick with dust that breathing becomes a conscious effort. If you work in construction, you'll build roads and buildings with your bare hands, moving earth and stone in a climate where the ground is frozen solid for most of the year. The work quotas are calculated not to be achievable, but to be just barely impossible. This isn't an accident or a bureaucratic oversight. It's the fundamental principle of the Gulag system. The quotas are set high enough that most prisoners will fail to meet them, which provides justification for reducing their already inadequate food rations, which weakens them further, which makes it even more likely they'll fail to meet future quotas. It's a death spiral designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum resources. Your daily food ration depends on your work performance, but even the full ration is designed to keep you on the edge of starvation. The bread is made with sawdust and other fillers that provide bulk but little nutrition. The soup is mostly hot water with cabbage leaves and perhaps, if you're lucky, a few grains of barley or a small piece of fat. The portions are measured precisely, not to meet your body's needs, but to keep you alive just long enough to be useful. This is only the beginning of your education in why you wouldn't last a day in the Gulag. We haven't even discussed the cold that penetrates every building, every piece of clothing, every corner of your existence. We haven't talked about the disease that spreads through the overcrowded barracks, or the violence that erupts when desperate people are pushed beyond their limits, or the psychological techniques used to break prisoners who still maintain hope of survival or release. The Soviet Gulag system wasn't just a prison. It was a machine designed to transform human beings into something less than human, to extract every possible benefit from their bodies and minds before discarding them like worn-out tools. And tomorrow, we'll explore exactly how that machine operated, day by day, hour by hour, in ways that would challenge everything you think you know about human endurance. So let's talk about what your first full day in the Gulag would actually look like, hour by hour, because understanding the routine is crucial to understanding why survival was so unlikely for someone unprepared for this particular form of hell. 4:30 in the morning, not 4:29, not 4:31. 4:30 exactly, because in the Gulag, punctuality wasn't about efficiency, it was about control. The wake-up call comes in the form of a metal bar hammered against a piece of railroad track, a sound that cuts through the frigid air and penetrates even the deepest sleep. There's no gentle awakening, no gradual transition from dreams to consciousness. One moment, you're unconscious, and the next, you're being dragged into a reality that feels like a nightmare. The barracks where you've spent the night are long, wooden structures designed for perhaps 50 people, but housing closer to 200. The air inside is thick with the breath, sweat, and fear of desperate human beings packed together like cargo. In winter, ice forms on the inside walls from condensation, and in summer, the heat is stifling and the air barely breathable. There are no individual bunks, just long wooden platforms divided into sections barely wide enough for one person to lie down. You share your sleeping space with a university professor who was accused of teaching bourgeois mathematics, and a collective farm worker who supposedly sabotaged the harvest by picking grain too slowly. Neither crime makes any logical sense, but logic isn't the point. The point is that the Soviet system needs bodies to feed its industrial projects, and any justification will do. Getting dressed is a challenge that would be almost comical if it weren't so deadly serious. You own exactly what you're wearing: a thin cotton shirt, pants that might have been adequate for autumn weather in Moscow, but are laughably inadequate for the Siberian wilderness, and boots that have already begun to fall apart during your train journey. If you're extremely fortunate, you might have managed to keep a coat, though the guards have a habit of confiscating anything that looks too warm, claiming it's evidence of bourgeois privilege. The other prisoners move with the mechanical efficiency of people who have learned that wasted motion means wasted energy, and wasted energy means death. They wrap their feet in strips of cloth torn from their clothing, layer every piece of fabric they own regardless of how it looks, and move quickly because standing still in the unheated barracks means losing precious body heat. 5 o'clock. Roll call. You file outside into air so cold it burns your lungs and makes your eyes water instantly. The guards count you like livestock, not because they care about your individual welfare, but because losing track of prisoners means paperwork. And paperwork means explanations to superiors, who are just as trapped in this system as you are, though admittedly more warmly dressed. The count takes 20 minutes, not because counting 200 people is particularly difficult, but because the process is designed to be humiliating. You stand at attention while guards walk among you, occasionally stopping to examine someone more closely, to ask questions that have no right answers, to remind everyone present that you exist entirely at their discretion. During roll call, you notice things that your previous life never prepared you to notice. The way prisoners shift their weight from foot to prevent frostbite. The particular grey colour that human skin takes on when it's not getting enough food or warmth. The hollow sound that voices make when people are too weak to speak with full breath. These details aren't just observations, they're survival information. Learning to read the signs of who's dying and who might last another week becomes as important as learning to read the weather. 5:30. Breakfast. The word breakfast is generous. What you receive is a piece of bread that's been calculated to provide exactly enough calories to keep you functional for your work assignment, and a cup of liquid that the guards call tea, but tastes like hot water that's been in contact with something organic at some point in its history. The bread is dark, dense, and often contains sawdust or other fillers that bulk up the loaf without adding nutritional value. You will learn to eat slowly, not because the food is enjoyable, but because eating is one of the few activities that provides any psychological comfort. Some prisoners try to save part of their bread for later in the day, but this is almost impossible. Hunger is a constant, gnawing presence that makes rational decision-making nearly impossible. The prisoners who successfully save food are usually the ones who have been in the camps long enough to develop the iron discipline that survival requires, and even they sometimes crack. The dining area is another lesson in the camp's hierarchy. Criminal prisoners eat first and get slightly larger portions. Political prisoners eat second and receive the standard ration. Prisoners who failed to meet their work quotas the previous day eat last and get reduced portions. Prisoners who are suspected of infractions might not eat at all. The system is designed so that every meal becomes a reminder of your place in the camp's social structure. 6 o'clock, work assignment. This is where your particular nightmare begins to take shape. The work assignments are posted on a board outside the administrative building, and prisoners crowd around it with the desperate intensity of people checking lottery numbers. Because in a very real sense, that's what this is. A lottery where the prizes are different forms of slow death. If your name appears next to forest detail, you're going to spend the next 12 hours cutting down trees with tools that have been deliberately kept dull. The Soviet system doesn't provide sharp axes or saws because sharp tools can be used as weapons, and because maintaining tools requires resources that the administration prefers to spend on other priorities. You'll work with an axe that bounces off tree trunks, a saw that binds in every cut, and your bare hands to move logs that weigh more than you do. If you're assigned to construction detail, you'll spend your day digging foundations in ground that's frozen solid for most of the year, mixing concrete with your hands because proper tools aren't available, and carrying materials across terrain that would challenge a healthy person in good weather. The construction projects themselves are often pointless. Roads that lead nowhere, buildings that will never be used, monuments to Soviet industrial capacity that exist only to justify the camp's existence. Mining detail is perhaps the worst assignment. You descend into tunnels that have been dug with minimal attention to safety, where cave-ins are routine and ventilation is non-existent. The work involves moving tons of rock and ore using primitive tools and human muscle power. The tunnels are dark, cold, and filled with dust that gets into your lungs and stays there. Many prisoners assigned to mining detail develop respiratory problems that kill them within months, which the camp administration considers an acceptable cost of doing business. The march to your worksite begins at 6:30, regardless of weather. You walk in formation, surrounded by guards with rifles who have been instructed to shoot anyone who steps out of line or fails to keep up with the group. The worksites are often miles from the camp, across terrain that ranges from swampy tundra to dense forest to rocky hills that offer no shelter from wind or precipitation. During the march, you begin to understand the geographic isolation that makes escape virtually impossible. In every direction, you see wilderness that stretches to the horizon. There are no roads except the ones built by prisoners, no towns except the administrative settlements that exist only to support the camps, no civilization of any kind that might offer sanctuary to an escaped prisoner. The landscape itself is a prison more effective than any wall or fence. 7 o'clock, work begins. The next 12 hours will test every assumption you've ever made about human endurance, about the relationship between effort and reward, about the basic fairness of existence. Your work quota has been calculated by administrators who have never performed the work themselves, using formulas that assume optimal conditions, perfect tools, and workers who are adequately fed and rested. None of these assumptions apply to your situation. The quota system is the engine that drives the entire Gulag machine. Every task has been broken down into measurable units: trees cut, tons of ore extracted, cubic meters of earth moved. Your daily food ration depends on meeting these quotas, but the quotas have been set at levels that are just barely impossible for someone in your physical condition. This isn't accidental. It's the fundamental logic of the system. The impossible quotas justify reduced rations, which weaken prisoners further, which makes future quotas even more impossible to achieve. If you're cutting trees, your quota might be to fell, delimb, and stack 20 large pines in a 12-hour day, using tools that barely function, in weather that makes exposed skin vulnerable to frostbite within minutes. If you're in the mines, you might be required to extract and move 5 tons of ore, working in tunnels where you can't stand upright, and where the air is thick with dust and gas. If you're on construction detail, you might need to dig 50 cubic meters of foundation in ground so hard that each shovelful requires multiple strikes with a pickaxe. The work itself is supervised by guards and prisoner trustees who have learned that their own survival depends on extracting maximum effort from the workers under their control. They carry clubs and whips, and they're not hesitant to use them on prisoners who appear to be slowing down. The violence isn't random or sadistic, it's calculated and systematic, designed to maintain productivity levels that justify the camp's existence to higher authorities. But the physical demands of the work are only part of the challenge. The psychological pressure is equally destructive. You're constantly aware that your performance is being measured, that failure to meet quotas will result in reduced food rations, that reduced rations will make tomorrow's work even more difficult. You're trapped in a system where success is impossible, but failure is deadly, where the only choice is between dying quickly or dying slowly. 9 o'clock. Your first break. The word break is misleading. You're allowed to stop working for exactly 10 minutes, just long enough to prevent complete collapse, but not long enough to recover any meaningful strength. There's no shelter from the weather, no place to sit except on frozen ground or snow, no food or water to replenish what you've lost during the morning's work. During these brief respites, you observe the other prisoners and begin to understand the social dynamics that determine who lives and who dies in this environment. The prisoners who have been here longest have developed a kind of mechanical efficiency, working at exactly the pace needed to avoid punishment while conserving every possible ounce of energy. They don't waste motion, they don't waste words, and they don't waste emotional energy on things they can't control. The newer prisoners, the ones who arrived on recent transports, are easy to identify. They still try to work at the pace they think the quotas require. They exhaust themselves in the first few hours, collapse by midday, and often die within weeks. The camp administration considers this acceptable wastage. There are always more prisoners arriving to replace the ones who don't survive the adjustment period. You also notice the prisoners who have crossed the invisible line between survival and surrender. They move more slowly, their eyes have a particular vacant quality, and other prisoners avoid them instinctively. These are the goners, the walking dead who might technically be alive but have already given up any hope of survival. They inform on other prisoners for scraps of food, perform the most degrading tasks without complaint, and serve as a constant reminder of what happens to people who lose their will to fight. The work resumes, and the next 4 hours pass in a blur of pain, exhaustion, and desperate calculation. Every movement becomes a conscious decision. Is the energy required for this action worth the result it will produce? Can you afford to lift this log, or should you drag it? Is it better to work quickly and risk exhaustion, or slowly and risk punishment for failing to meet your quota? Your hands, unprotected by gloves that don't exist, develop blisters that break and bleed, then freeze in the cold air. Your back, unaccustomed to this kind of labor, begins to spasm and cramp. Your legs, weakened by inadequate food and the constant cold, shake with the effort of supporting your body weight. But stopping isn't an option, because stopping means punishment, and punishment means even less food, and less food means death. 1 o'clock, the midday meal. This consists of a bowl of soup that's mostly hot water, with a few cabbage leaves, and perhaps a small piece of fat floating on the surface. The soup is served outside, regardless of weather, and you eat it standing up because there's nowhere to sit. The bowl is metal and conducts cold so efficiently that the soup begins to freeze almost immediately. You learn to drink it as quickly as possible, not because you're particularly hungry, though you are, but because lukewarm soup provides a few minutes of internal warmth that helps your body maintain core temperature. The social dynamics around food distribution reveal another layer of the camp's hierarchy. Criminal prisoners get served first and receive slightly more soup. Political prisoners who have been cooperative get standard portions. Prisoners who have been identified as troublemakers get less. Prisoners who failed to meet quotas get significantly less. And prisoners who are suspected of infractions might get nothing at all. The system ensures that every meal becomes a reminder of your status and a motivation to comply with camp rules. After the meal, there's another brief break, and then work resumes for the afternoon shift. The afternoon work is always harder than the morning work because you're already exhausted Your body is running on reserves it doesn't have, and the psychological pressure of knowing that your daily quota is still incomplete begins to weigh on your decision-making ability. This is where prisoners begin to make the desperate choices that define survival in the Gulag system. Do you help a fellow prisoner who's struggling, knowing that it will slow down your own work and make your quota harder to achieve? Do you report infractions you observe, knowing that cooperation with the authorities might earn you better treatment? Do you steal tools or food from other prisoners, knowing that their failure might mean your survival? These aren't moral questions in any normal sense. They're calculations made by people who have been pushed beyond the point where normal moral reasoning applies. The camp system is designed to create these impossible choices, to force prisoners into behavior that destroys their sense of human dignity and solidarity. Because prisoners who see each other as competitors, rather than fellow victims, are less likely to organize resistance, less likely to maintain the kind of mutual support that might help them survive, and more likely to accept the camp's logic as inevitable. But we're still only halfway through your first day, and already the accumulated stress, exhaustion, and desperation would be pushing you toward choices that your previous life never prepared you to make. The afternoon work shift, the evening meal, the return to the barracks, and the long, cold night ahead will test your capacity for survival in ways that go far beyond physical endurance. Tomorrow, we'll explore how the Gulag system broke down the psychological defenses that allow human beings to maintain hope, dignity, and sanity in extreme circumstances. Because surviving the physical challenges of the camps was only the first test. Surviving the systematic destruction of everything that makes life worth living was the real measure of who lived and who died in Stalin's frozen hell. 7 o'clock in the evening. The afternoon work shift finally ends, but calling it an end is misleading. You're not finishing work. You're transitioning from one form of controlled misery to another. The march back to camp happens in darkness for most of the year, with guards who are as cold and exhausted as you are, which makes them more likely to use violence to keep the column moving at the required pace. The return march is where you truly begin to understand the accumulated damage of a single day in the Gulag system. Prisoners who seemed functional in the morning now stumble and fall. The ones who push themselves too hard to meet their quotas can barely walk. The newer prisoners, the ones who haven't yet learned to pace themselves, often collapse entirely and have to be dragged or carried by their fellow inmates, which slows the entire column and earns everyone collective punishment. You learn to keep your head down during the march, not out of shame, but out of necessity. Looking around means seeing things that will haunt your dreams. Prisoners with frostbitten faces where the skin has turned black. Men and women who have soiled themselves because they lack the strength to maintain basic bodily control. Bodies that have begun to consume their own muscle tissue because there isn't enough food to sustain basic metabolic functions. The guards count you again at the camp gates, not because they care about your welfare, but because losing prisoners creates paperwork that might reflect poorly on their performance evaluations. The count takes longer in the evening because some prisoners are too weak to stand properly. Others have developed the kind of vacant stare that indicates complete psychological breakdown. And a few have died during the work shift and must be accounted for separately. 8 o'clock, the evening meal. This consists of the same bread and soup you received at breakfast, but now your body is so depleted that even this inadequate nutrition feels like salvation. You've burned thousands of calories during the work shift, but consumed perhaps 800, which means your body has been cannibalizing itself for hours. The evening meal doesn't restore what you've lost. It merely slows down the process of systemic collapse. The evening meal is also when you discover one of the Gulag's most insidious psychological weapons, the constant uncertainty about food distribution. Sometimes there's enough soup for everyone, sometimes there isn't, and the last prisoners in line receive nothing. Sometimes the bread is moldy or contaminated, and eating it makes you sick, but not eating it means starvation. Sometimes there are extra rations available for prisoners who provide information about infractions or escape plans they've observed. You're faced with calculations that would have been unthinkable in your previous life. Do you try to befriend the prisoners who serve food, knowing that friendship might mean slightly larger portions? Do you inform on prisoners who are planning resistance activities, knowing that cooperation might earn you better treatment? Do you steal food from prisoners who are too weak to protect themselves, knowing that their loss might mean your survival? These aren't moral choices in any traditional sense. They're survival decisions made by people who have been systematically stripped of the social structures that normally guide human behavior. The camp administration encourages this moral degradation because prisoners who see each other as threats are less likely to organize collective resistance, less likely to maintain the kind of mutual support that might help them survive, and more likely to accept the camp's logic as natural and inevitable. 9 o'clock. Return to the barracks. The barracks are unheated wooden structures that provide shelter from wind and precipitation, but no warmth beyond what can be generated by 200 human bodies packed into a space designed for 50. In winter, the temperature inside might be only slightly higher than the temperature outside. In summer, the lack of ventilation makes the air thick and stifling. The sleeping arrangements reveal another layer of the camp's social hierarchy. Criminal prisoners and trustees get the sleeping spaces closest to the center of the barracks, where body heat from other prisoners provides the most warmth. Political prisoners get spaces along the walls, where the cold penetrates most effectively. Prisoners who are suspected of infractions or who have failed to meet work quotas get spaces near the doors, where drafts and foot traffic makes sleep nearly impossible. Your sleeping space is a section of wooden platform, barely wide enough for one person to lie down, shared with prisoners who are strangers, but who become intimately familiar through forced proximity. You sleep wearing every piece of clothing you own, including your boots, because removing anything means losing body heat that you might not be able to recover. You sleep with your arms wrapped around your bread ration for the next day, because leaving it unguarded means waking up to find it stolen. The sounds of the barracks at night are a symphony of human suffering that would be unbearable if you weren't too exhausted to process it fully. There's the constant coughing of prisoners with respiratory diseases, the groaning of men and women whose bodies are failing from malnutrition and overwork, the quiet weeping of people who still have enough emotional energy left to cry, and the delirious muttering of prisoners whose minds have begun to disconnect from reality. Sleep, when it comes, is not restful. Your body is too cold, too hungry, and too damaged by the day's work to achieve the kind of deep rest that allows for physical recovery. You drift in and out of consciousness, aware of every movement around you, every change in temperature, every sound that might indicate danger or opportunity. Real sleep, the kind that restores strength and mental clarity, becomes a luxury that the camp system deliberately denies. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight. The long vigil begins. The barracks never become truly quiet because there are always prisoners who can't sleep, prisoners who are dying, prisoners who have lost their minds and no longer understand where they are or what has happened to them. You lie on your wooden platform and listen to conversations conducted in whispers, desperate attempts to maintain human connection in an environment designed to isolate and dehumanize. Some prisoners talk about their families, wondering whether their wives and children are still alive, whether they've been arrested as associates of enemies of the state, whether they even remember the person who has been swallowed by the Gulag system. Others make plans for escape that everyone knows are impossible, but that provide psychological comfort. A few still maintain hope that their cases will be reviewed, that the authorities will recognize their innocence, that they'll be released and allowed to return to their previous lives. But increasingly, as the weeks and months pass, the conversations become more practical and more desperate. Prisoners share information about which guards can be bribed, which work assignments are least likely to kill you quickly, which prisoners can be trusted, and which ones inform for extra food They develop elaborate theories about the camp administration's decision-making process, looking for patterns that might help them predict and avoid punishment. The cold penetrates everything. It seeps through the wooden walls, rises from the ground, and hangs in the air like a living thing. Your breath creates clouds of vapor that freeze and fall as ice crystals. The moisture from 200 breathing bodies condenses on the walls and ceiling, then freezes into patterns that look almost beautiful until you realize they represent the gradual freezing of human life itself. You learn to sleep in positions that conserve body heat. Curled into a tight ball with your knees against your chest, your arms wrapped around your torso, your face buried against your body to warm the air you breathe. You learn to share body heat with other prisoners without creating the kind of intimacy that might be misinterpreted by guards or other prisoners. You learn to wake up instantly when your body temperature begins to drop dangerously, to move just enough to restore circulation without disturbing the prisoners around you. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. The deep night hours, when the human body's resistance is at its lowest, when prisoners die quietly in their sleep, when the line between unconsciousness and death becomes almost invisible. The guards make periodic checks, not to ensure prisoner welfare, but to count bodies and remove the ones that have stopped breathing. Death during the night is so common that it barely registers as an event worth noting. You find yourself making calculations that your previous life never prepared you to make. How much of your daily bread ration can you afford to eat now? And how much should you save for tomorrow morning when your body will be desperate for any source of energy? How much movement is necessary to prevent frostbite? And how much movement will disturb other prisoners and potentially create conflicts that could result in violence? How do you maintain enough hope to survive another day without maintaining so much hope that disappointment becomes psychologically devastating? The psychological pressure during these night hours is as dangerous as the physical cold. This is when the full reality of your situation becomes impossible to ignore or rationalize. You're not temporarily imprisoned, you're permanently exiled from human civilization. You're not being punished for a specific crime. You're being processed by a system that sees you as raw material for industrial projects. You're not going to be released when your innocence is established. You're going to work until your body fails, and then you're going to die. Some prisoners break during these night hours. They begin talking to themselves, or to people who aren't there, or to God in languages that don't exist. They develop elaborate delusions that allow them to escape mentally from circumstances they can't escape physically. The guards and camp administration consider this psychological breakdown a form of malingering, evidence that prisoners are trying to avoid work assignments through fake mental illness. But the prisoners who break completely are, in some ways, the fortunate ones. They're no longer fully conscious of their suffering, no longer capable of the kind of rational thought that makes every day a conscious choice between different forms of slow death. The prisoners who maintain their sanity, who continue to understand exactly what is happening to them and why, face a different and perhaps more cruel form of torture. 4 o'clock in the morning. The cycle begins again. The metal bar strikes the railroad track. The sound cuts through the frozen air, and you're dragged back into consciousness for another day that will be essentially identical to the one you've just survived. Your body has not recovered from yesterday's work. If anything, you're weaker than you were 24 hours ago. Your psychological reserves have been further depleted by a night of inadequate sleep and constant stress. Your hope, if you still maintain any, has been eroded by the recognition that tomorrow will bring exactly the same challenges with even fewer resources to meet them. And this, remember, is just your first day. You haven't yet experienced the dysentery that will leave you too weak to work, but still required to meet your quotas. You haven't yet survived the pneumonia that will fill your lungs with fluid and make every breath a conscious effort. You haven't yet endured the frostbite that will cost you fingers and toes, making manual labor even more difficult. You haven't yet faced the psychological pressure of watching fellow prisoners die and knowing that you might be next. You haven't yet learned to navigate the complex social dynamics that determine who gets extra food, who gets easier work assignments, who gets medical attention when they become ill. You haven't yet developed the emotional numbness that allows long-term prisoners to watch suffering without being psychologically destroyed by it. You haven't yet made the moral compromises that survival requires, the small betrayals and collaborations that keep you alive while destroying your sense of human dignity. This is why you wouldn't last a day in the Gulag. Not because you lack courage or determination, but because the system was specifically designed to break people like you. People with normal human responses to suffering, normal expectations about the relationship between effort and reward, normal assumptions about the basic fairness of existence. The Gulag machine was built to process people with these normal human characteristics and transform them into something else entirely: broken, desperate, morally compromised survivors who had learned to accept the unacceptable as the natural order of things. But even understanding the systematic nature of this destruction doesn't prepare you for the specific ways it operates, the daily mechanisms through which human dignity is stripped away, piece by piece, until nothing remains but the desperate animal instinct to survive one more day. Tomorrow, we'll explore how the camp system used medical care, punishment, and the constant threat of death to maintain control over prisoners who had already lost everything they thought made life worth living. The morning of your second day arrives with the same metallic clang, but now your body responds differently. Where yesterday you might have startled awake with the confused panic of someone thrust into a nightmare, today you wake with the dull recognition that this is your reality. Your muscles, pushed beyond their limits during yesterday's work shift, have stiffened overnight into a rigid architecture of pain. Every joint feels locked in place. Every movement requires a conscious decision to endure the sharp protests of tissue that has been damaged and given no opportunity to heal. But physical pain, you're beginning to learn, is almost a luxury compared to the psychological revelation that greets you in those first moments of consciousness. Yesterday, some part of your mind still believed this might be temporary, that reason would prevail, that someone would recognize the mistake and restore you to your proper place in the world. Today, that comforting delusion has been stripped away by the simple fact of waking up in the same wooden barracks, surrounded by the same desperate faces, facing the same impossible choices. The other prisoners around you move with a mechanical efficiency that you're starting to understand isn't just about conserving energy, it's about conserving hope, conserving emotion, conserving the parts of human consciousness that make suffering unbearable. They've learned to approach each day as a technical problem to be solved rather than an experience to be endured, because approaching it as an experience would drive them insane. Your breakfast bread tastes different this morning, not because the bread itself has changed, but because your body's relationship to hunger has been fundamentally altered. Yesterday, you were a person who happened to be hungry. Today, you are hunger that happens to be housed in a human body. The bread isn't food in any meaningful sense. It's fuel, calculated to provide exactly enough calories to make your body useful for another 12 hours of labor. The work assignment board reveals another layer of the camp's systematic cruelty. You're not assigned to the same detail as yesterday, which means you can't build on whatever minimal skills or relationships you might have developed. Instead, you're sent to the quarry, where prisoners break rocks with sledgehammers and move the pieces using wheelbarrows that are deliberately kept in poor repair. The constant reassignment of prisoners to different work details isn't accidental. It's designed to prevent the formation of stable groups that might develop solidarity or resistance strategies. The march to the quarry takes you past the camp's medical facility, a wooden building slightly larger than the barracks but just as poorly heated. Through the windows, you can see prisoners lying on wooden platforms that serve as beds, their faces grey with the particular colour that indicates systemic organ failure. The camp doctor, when he bothers to make appearances, operates according to a simple principle. Prisoners who can work receive minimal treatment to keep them functional. Prisoners who can't work are left to die. and prisoners who might recover enough to work again receive slightly more attention. Medical care in the Gulag isn't about healing. It's about maintaining the camp's productivity levels. A prisoner with a broken leg might receive a splint if the break is simple and likely to heal quickly. A prisoner with pneumonia might receive aspirin if aspirin is available, and if the prisoner's work record suggests they're worth saving. A prisoner with dysentery receives nothing except assignment to work details that don't require them to be far from latrine facilities, because treating dysentery requires resources that the camp administration prefers to allocate elsewhere. The psychological impact of this medical system extends far beyond the physical suffering it creates. Prisoners learn that their bodies are not their own, that pain and illness are not problems to be solved, but conditions to be managed according to the camp's economic calculations. A prisoner who becomes ill faces not just the physical challenge of the disease, but the knowledge that their survival depends entirely on whether treating them serves the camp's interests. At the quarry, you discover that yesterday's tree cutting was actually one of the easier work assignments. Breaking rocks with a sledgehammer requires a different kind of strength, a different kind of endurance, and a different kind of psychological resilience. The rocks don't yield gradually like trees. They resist completely until they shatter suddenly, sending fragments flying in all directions. Your hands, already damaged from yesterday's work, develop new blisters on top of the old ones, then calluses that crack and bleed, then scar tissue that makes gripping tools increasingly difficult. The work quota at the quarry is measured in tons of broken rock, and the quotas have been calculated based on the performance of prisoners who had been working for months, who had developed the specific muscle groups and techniques that this kind of work requires, and who were in better physical condition than new arrivals. You're expected to match their output immediately, without training, without adequate tools, and without the physical conditioning that would make such output possible. The other prisoners in your work detail have learned to recognize the signs of someone who won't survive the adjustment period. They watch you with the kind of detached interest that might be shown to a wounded animal, calculating whether you'll last long enough to be useful as a work partner or whether associating with you will only drag down their own performance ratings. Their calculations aren't cruel in any personal sense. They're simply realistic assessments based on experience that has taught them to see fellow prisoners as resources rather than as human beings deserving of sympathy. The guards supervising the quarry work have developed their own system for maintaining productivity. They carry wooden clubs and use them not randomly, but strategically, on prisoners whose output has fallen below acceptable levels. The violence isn't sadistic. It's administrative, designed to modify behavior rather than to inflict suffering for its own sake. A prisoner who receives a beating for slow work usually increases their pace temporarily, which improves overall productivity numbers and helps the guards meet their own performance targets. But the most insidious aspect of the quarry work is the way it transforms your relationship to your own body. Each swing of the sledgehammer sends shockwaves through your arms, shoulders, and spine that accumulate over hours into a constant vibration of damage. Your body begins to feel like a machine that's being operated beyond its design specifications, with parts that are wearing out faster than they can be repaired. You start to think of your hands as tools that happen to be attached to you rather than as parts of yourself, because thinking of them as parts of yourself makes the pain unbearable. The midday meal at the quarry consists of the same watery soup served at the camp, but now you understand why prisoners fight over position in the serving line. The soup is prepared in large batches and transported to work sites in containers that don't retain heat effectively. Prisoners served early receive soup that's merely lukewarm. Prisoners served late receive soup that's barely above freezing. In weather where the air temperature is well below zero, the difference between lukewarm soup and cold soup can determine whether your body maintains enough core temperature to continue functioning. You also learn that the social dynamics around food distribution extend beyond simple hierarchy to include complex networks of favor trading and information sharing. Prisoners who provide useful intelligence about escape plans, infractions, or resistance activities receive slightly larger portions. Prisoners who volunteer for the most dangerous work assignments receive additional bread rations. Prisoners who inform on fellow inmates who are hoarding food or planning infractions receive protection from guards and better treatment in medical situations. These transactions aren't conducted openly, but through subtle signals and understood protocols that new prisoners must learn quickly or face exclusion from the informal economy that determines survival. A prisoner who shares information about a planned work slowdown might find an extra piece of fat in their soup. A prisoner who reports that another inmate has been stealing tools might discover that their work assignment has been changed to something slightly less dangerous. The system creates a web of complicity that makes resistance almost impossible, because every prisoner becomes simultaneously a potential ally and a potential threat. The afternoon work shift introduces you to another dimension of Gulag life, the arbitrary nature of punishment and reward. A guard might decide that overall productivity is too low and announce that evening food rations will be reduced for everyone unless output improves immediately. Or a camp administrator might visit the worksite and decide that certain prisoners look too well fed, leading to reduced rations for prisoners whose only crime was maintaining slightly better physical condition than their fellow inmates. These arbitrary decisions aren't random. They're part of a systematic strategy to keep prisoners off balance, unable to predict what behavior will lead to better or worse treatment. Prisoners who develop successful survival strategies find that the rules change without notice. Prisoners who learn to navigate the camp's social systems discover that their knowledge becomes obsolete as guards are rotated, administrators are replaced, and policies are modified according to directives from Moscow that have nothing to do with local conditions. The psychological impact of this uncertainty is devastating because it prevents prisoners from developing any sense of control over their circumstances. In normal life, people can improve their situations through effort, planning, and good decision-making. In the Gulag, effort might be rewarded or punished depending on factors that prisoners can't understand or influence. Planning becomes impossible because the rules that govern daily life change without notice. Good decision-making becomes meaningless because the criteria for what constitutes good decisions are controlled by people who see prisoners as expendable resources rather than as human beings with legitimate interests. By late afternoon, your body has entered a state that experienced prisoners recognize as the beginning of systemic breakdown. Your blood sugar has dropped to levels that make concentration difficult. Your muscles have depleted their energy reserves and begun consuming protein from other parts of your body. Your core temperature has dropped enough that your extremities are beginning to lose sensation, making precise movements increasingly difficult. Your psychological state has shifted from conscious suffering to a kind of mechanical endurance that operates below the level of rational thought. This is the state that the Gulag system is designed to produce. Prisoners who are functional enough to perform labor, but too depleted to think clearly about resistance or escape. Prisoners in this condition make desperate decisions, accept degrading compromises, and gradually abandon the moral principles that might otherwise motivate them to challenge the system. They become collaborative, not because they support the Soviet system, but because collaboration becomes the only available survival strategy. The evening march back to camp reveals another aspect of Gulag life that you couldn't have anticipated: the way that extreme suffering creates its own form of community. Prisoners who have learned to see each other as competitors during work hours sometimes help each other during the march, sharing body heat, supporting prisoners who are too weak to walk unassisted, and passing along information about guards' moods and administrators' decisions. This solidarity isn't based on affection or shared political beliefs. It's based on the recognition that individual survival sometimes depends on group survival. But even this limited form of mutual aid is constrained by the camp's systematic encouragement of betrayal. Prisoners who are seen helping each other might be suspected of planning resistance activities. Prisoners who share food or resources might be accused of hoarding or theft. Prisoners who provide emotional support to fellow inmates might be classified as troublemakers who are undermining camp discipline. The system is designed so that every act of human decency becomes a potential source of danger. The evening meal on your second day tastes different, not because the food has changed, but because your body's relationship to nutrition has been fundamentally altered. You no longer eat because you're hungry. You eat because eating is a necessary technical operation that provides fuel for tomorrow's work. The bread and soup aren't satisfying in any emotional sense. They're merely adequate to prevent complete physical collapse. You find yourself calculating the caloric content of every mouthful, estimating how much energy it will provide, and wondering whether it's enough to sustain another day of labor. The return to the barracks on your second night reveals social dynamics that weren't visible during your first day. Prisoners who have been in the camp for months or years have developed complex relationships based not on friendship or shared interests, but on mutual utility. They form partnerships for warmth sharing, alliances for protection against more aggressive prisoners, and information sharing networks that help them navigate the camp's bureaucracy. These relationships aren't personal in any normal sense. They're survival strategies disguised as human connections. Your sleeping space has been reassigned, not because of any decision you made, but because the camp administration periodically shuffles prisoners to prevent the formation of stable groups. Tonight you're sleeping between a former party official who was accused of Trotskyist sympathies and a peasant who was arrested for hiding grain from state collectors. Neither man speaks much, but their presence teaches you something important about the Gulag system. It doesn't matter what you're accused of, what your background is, or what your political beliefs might be. Once you're inside the system, you're all equally expendable raw material for Soviet industrial projects. The night sounds are different on your second night because you're learning to interpret them. The coughing that seemed random yesterday now reveals patterns that indicate different stages of respiratory disease. The moaning that seemed like general suffering now distinguishes between the pain of overworked muscles, the discomfort of gastrointestinal illness, and the delirium of prisoners whose minds are beginning to disconnect from reality. The whispered conversations now reveal themselves as strategic discussions about work assignments, guard behavior, and survival techniques. Sleep, when it comes, brings dreams that are more disturbing than the waking reality they interrupt. Your unconscious mind, still processing the trauma of the last 24 hours, creates elaborate fantasies about escape, rescue, and return to normal life. But these dreams are cruel because waking up means confronting the reality that escape is impossible, rescue is not coming, and normal life no longer exists for you. Many prisoners learn to prefer insomnia to the psychological torture of hopeful dreams, followed by devastating awakening. The deep night hours reveal another dimension of Gulag psychology. The way that extreme suffering strips away social pretenses and reveals the basic animal instincts that normally remain hidden beneath civilized behavior. Prisoners steal from each other, not because they're bad people, but because hunger makes theft feel like a survival necessity. Prisoners inform on each other, not because they support the Soviet system, but because cooperation with authorities sometimes provides small advantages that might mean the difference between life and death. These moral compromises create a psychological burden that's almost as difficult to bear as the physical hardships of camp life. Prisoners who maintain their ethical principles often die quickly because they can't make the compromises that survival requires. Prisoners who abandon their principles often survive longer, but face the knowledge that they've become people they can't respect. The camp system is designed to create this impossible choice. Maintain your humanity and die, or abandon your humanity and live as something less than human. By the time the metal bar strikes the railroad track to signal the beginning of your third day, You understand something that couldn't have been explained to you before you experienced it. The Gulag system isn't just about punishment or even about extracting labor from prisoners. It's about transforming human beings into something else entirely, breaking down the psychological structures that make people capable of resistance, solidarity, and hope. It's about creating a population of survivors who are so damaged by their experience that they can never again pose a threat to the system that destroyed them. And this transformation happens not through dramatic torture or spectacular violence, but through the accumulation of small cruelties, impossible choices, and systematic degradation that continues day after day, month after month, year after year, until prisoners forget what they were before they entered the camps and can't imagine what they might become if they ever leave. This is why you wouldn't last a day in the Gulag. Not because the system would kill you quickly, but because it would change you so fundamentally that the person who emerged, if anyone emerged at all, would no longer be recognizably you. The third morning brings with it a realization that settles into your bones like the perpetual cold. You're no longer the same person who was arrested 3 days ago. That person had assumptions about human nature, about the relationship between suffering and meaning, about the basic structure of civilized existence. That person is gone, replaced by something that thinks primarily in terms of calories, warmth, and the micropolitics of survival. Your body has begun adapting to starvation in ways that would fascinate a medical researcher and horrify anyone with normal human empathy. Your metabolism has slowed dramatically, making every movement feel like you're operating underwater. Your body has started consuming muscle tissue to fuel basic organ function, which means you're physically weaker today than you were yesterday, and tomorrow you'll be weaker still. Your digestive system has adjusted to processing the sawdust and fillers in the camp bread, though processing might be too generous a term for what's actually happening. But the physical changes are nothing compared to the psychological adaptations that are occurring below the level of conscious thought. You find yourself automatically categorizing other prisoners not as fellow human beings in distress, but as potential sources of information, competition for resources, or threats to your own survival. When a prisoner in your barracks dies during the night, your first thought isn't grief or sympathy, it's calculation about whether his death might mean slightly larger food portions for the survivors. This morning's work assignment sends you to the lumber mill, where prisoners operate machinery that would be considered unsafe in any normal industrial setting. The saws have no guards, the belts have no covers, and the operators receive no training beyond a shouted explanation from a trustee who learned the job by watching his predecessor lose 3 fingers to a cutting blade. Industrial accidents aren't just common, they're expected, factored into the camp's productivity calculations like any other form of equipment wear. The lumber mill reveals another layer of the Gulag's systematic cruelty, the way it uses prisoners' professional skills against them. The camp administration has identified you as someone with mechanical aptitude, not because they want to utilize your abilities constructively, but because prisoners who understand machinery can be held responsible when equipment breaks down. If a saw blade dulls prematurely, you'll be accused of sabotage. If a belt snaps, you'll be charged with wrecking. If productivity falls below quota levels, you'll be punished for counter-revolutionary activity. This weaponization of competence creates a psychological trap that's particularly devastating for prisoners who had professional identities before their arrest. Using your skills to improve camp operations feels like collaboration with your oppressors, but deliberately performing poorly results in punishment that makes survival even more difficult. You're forced to choose between professional integrity and physical survival, knowing that either choice compromises something essential about who you are. The other prisoners at the lumber mill have developed coping strategies that reveal the true genius of the Gulag system. They work just efficiently enough to avoid punishment, but not so efficiently that quotas are increased. They share technical knowledge that keeps the machinery functional but not optimized. They help each other just enough to prevent complete breakdown of the work detail, but not enough to create the kind of solidarity that might threaten camp discipline. These careful calibrations require a form of intelligence that's simultaneously sophisticated and degraded. Prisoners become expert at reading guard behavior, predicting administrative decisions, and navigating bureaucratic systems, but they lose the capacity for long-term planning, abstract thinking, and moral reasoning. They develop acute sensitivity to immediate threats and opportunities, while losing the ability to imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. The morning break at the lumber mill introduces you to one of the camp's most insidious control mechanisms, the systematic creation of hope, followed by its equally systematic destruction. A trustee announces that prisoners who exceed their quotas for a full week will be eligible for additional food rations and warmer clothing. The announcement creates a surge of desperate energy as prisoners push themselves beyond their physical limits, competing with each other for rewards that may or may not actually exist. By the end of the week, it becomes clear that the promised rewards were never real. The additional rations don't materialize, the warmer clothing doesn't appear, and the prisoners who destroyed their health, pursuing impossible quotas, find themselves weaker and more vulnerable than before. But by then, a new set of promises has been introduced. Early release for exceptional productivity, letters to family members for cooperative behavior, medical treatment for prisoners who provide useful information about fellow inmates. This cycle of false hope serves multiple purposes in the camp's psychological warfare strategy. It prevents prisoners from settling into complete despair, which might lead to the kind of passive resistance that would reduce productivity. It encourages prisoners to exhaust themselves pursuing rewards that don't exist, which weakens them physically and makes rebellion less likely. Most importantly, it trains prisoners to accept the camp's authority as the sole source of potential improvement in their circumstances, making them psychologically dependent on the very system that's destroying them. The midday meal brings news that several prisoners from yesterday's work details have been sent to the punishment cells, not for any specific infractions, but as part of a routine demonstration of administrative authority. The punishment cells are wooden boxes, barely large enough for a person to sit upright, unheated and unlit, where prisoners are kept on reduced rations for periods ranging from days to weeks. Prisoners who emerge from the punishment cells are often permanently damaged, either physically from the cold and confinement, or psychologically from the complete sensory deprivation. The arbitrary nature of these punishments is precisely the point. When punishment is connected to specific behavior, prisoners can modify their behavior to avoid future punishment. When punishment is random and unpredictable, prisoners live in constant fear and spend their mental energy trying to identify patterns that don't exist, rather than planning resistance activities. The camp administration has learned that arbitrary terror is more effective than systematic brutality because it prevents prisoners from developing coherent strategies for survival. You notice that your own thinking is beginning to change in response to this environment. Where 3 days ago you might have felt outrage at the injustice of arbitrary punishment, now you feel primarily relief that you weren't selected. Where you might once have felt solidarity with the punished prisoners, now you feel a kind of superstitious gratitude that whatever mysterious criteria were used for selection didn't include you. This shift from moral reasoning to survival calculation is exactly what the camp system is designed to produce. The afternoon work shift introduces you to the lumber mill's most dangerous operation, the loading dock, where prisoners move heavy logs using equipment that consists primarily of ropes, pulleys, and human muscle power. The work requires coordination between multiple prisoners, but the camp's social dynamics make cooperation extremely difficult. Prisoners who have been identified as potential troublemakers are deliberately assigned to teams with prisoners who have incentives to report infractions, creating a situation where every workgroup contains potential informants. The loading dock is also where you encounter the camp's medical system in its most practical form. Industrial accidents happen several times per day. Crushed fingers, broken bones, deep cuts from splintered wood. backs thrown out by lifting loads that exceed human capacity. The camp's medical response is swift and efficient, but only for injuries that affect productivity. A prisoner with a crushed hand receives immediate attention because hand injuries prevent manual labor. A prisoner with internal injuries from a falling log receives minimal care because internal damage isn't visible and doesn't obviously impact work performance. This triage system teaches prisoners to evaluate their own injuries, not in terms of pain or long-term health consequences, but in terms of how the injuries might affect their work assignments and food rations. A prisoner with a broken finger learns to splint it himself and continue working rather than report it to medical staff who might classify him as malingering. A prisoner with chest pain from overexertion learns to work through it rather than seek treatment that might result in reduced rations for failing to meet quotas. The psychological impact of this medical system extends far beyond the physical suffering it creates. Prisoners learn that their bodies are not their own, that pain is not a signal to seek help, but a problem to be managed privately, and that the normal human response to injury, seeking care and comfort, is a luxury they can't afford. This disconnection from their own physical needs is another step in the systematic dehumanization that the camp system is designed to accomplish. The evening march back to camp takes you past the camp's administrative buildings, where you can see warm light in the windows and smoke rising from chimneys. The contrast between the administrator's comfortable quarters and the prisoners' brutal living conditions isn't accidental. It's part of the camp's psychological architecture. Prisoners are meant to see that comfort and warmth exist within the camp's boundaries, but only for people who have earned them through collaboration with the system. Some prisoners develop elaborate fantasies about joining the administrative staff, imagining that cooperation with camp authorities might eventually earn them positions of relative privilege. These fantasies serve the camp's interests by creating a class of prisoners who are invested in the system's continuation rather than its destruction. Prisoners who hope to improve their circumstances by working within the system are less likely to support resistance activities and more likely to inform on fellow prisoners who express dissatisfaction. The evening meal on your third day introduces you to another dimension of camp psychology, the way that extreme deprivation makes small improvements feel like major victories. Tonight's soup contains a few more pieces of cabbage than usual, and this minor variation creates a surge of gratitude that would be comical if it weren't so tragic. Your brain, desperate for any evidence that circumstances might improve, interprets random variation in food quality as a sign of administrative benevolence. This psychological vulnerability to minor improvements is systematically exploited by the camp administration. Occasional small increases in food rations, temporary improvements in working conditions, or rare permissions for prisoners to receive letters from family create bursts of hope that make prisoners more compliant and less likely to support resistance activities. The improvements are always temporary and always withdrawn without explanation, but the memory of better treatment keeps prisoners focused on the possibility of reward rather than the reality of systematic oppression. The return to the barracks on your third night reveals social dynamics that are becoming clearer as you learn to read the subtle signals that govern prisoner interactions. Prisoners have developed elaborate hierarchies based not on their crimes or backgrounds, but on their perceived likelihood of survival. Prisoners who show signs of physical or psychological breakdown are gradually excluded from social groups, not out of cruelty, but out of the practical recognition that association with dying prisoners can be dangerous. This social Darwinism creates a feedback loop that accelerates the death of prisoners who are already struggling. Prisoners who are excluded from social networks lose access to shared information about guard behavior, work strategies, and survival techniques. They're more likely to make mistakes that result in punishment, less likely to receive help during medical emergencies, and more likely to be selected for dangerous work assignments. The camp's social system becomes a mechanism for identifying and eliminating the weakest prisoners without requiring direct intervention from the administration. Your sleeping arrangements have been changed again, and tonight you're placed between two prisoners who represent different adaptation strategies. One is a former engineer who has maintained his sanity by treating camp life as a technical problem to be solved, developing elaborate theories about administrative decision-making and detailed plans for optimizing his survival chances. The other is a former peasant who has adapted by abandoning conscious thought entirely, moving through his daily routine in a state of mechanical compliance that requires no emotional investment or moral reasoning. Both strategies have advantages and disadvantages that become clearer as you listen to their nighttime conversations. The engineer's analytical approach helps him navigate camp bureaucracy effectively, but his constant mental activity makes it difficult for him to achieve the kind of psychological numbness that makes daily suffering bearable. The peasant's emotional shutdown protects him from despair, but his lack of strategic thinking makes him vulnerable to arbitrary punishment and unable to take advantage of opportunities for improved treatment. You realize that you're developing your own adaptation strategy, one that combines elements of both approaches, while adding new techniques that you're discovering through trial and error. You're learning to think analytically about immediate survival problems while shutting down emotional responses to suffering that you can't control. You're developing the ability to switch rapidly between different psychological states, depending on whether you're dealing with guards, fellow prisoners, or the internal experience of your own degradation. This psychological flexibility is a form of intelligence, but it's also a form of fragmentation that would be recognized as dissociation in any normal therapeutic context. You're becoming multiple people. The strategist who calculates food distribution patterns, the worker who performs labor efficiently enough to avoid punishment, the prisoner who maintains just enough hope to continue functioning, and the observer who watches all of these performances with detached curiosity. The night sounds on your third night include new elements that you're learning to interpret. The particular breathing pattern that indicates a prisoner is dying. The whispered negotiations that redistribute possessions from prisoners who won't survive until morning, and the quiet prayers in languages you don't recognize offered by prisoners who still maintain some connection to spiritual beliefs. These sounds create a soundtrack of human adaptation to impossible circumstances, a symphony of survival strategies playing out in real time. Sleep brings dreams that are becoming more practical and less fantastical. Instead of elaborate escape scenarios or reunions with family, you dream about work techniques that might help you meet quotas, food preparation methods that might extract more nutrition from camp rations, and social strategies that might improve your position in the prisoner hierarchy. Your unconscious mind is adapting to camp reality by focusing on problems that actually have solutions rather than wasting energy on hopes that can't be fulfilled. The deep night hours reveal another aspect of camp psychology that couldn't be understood without direct experience: the way that extreme suffering creates its own form of meaning. Prisoners who have lost everything that previously gave their lives purpose sometimes develop an intense focus on survival itself as a form of resistance. Staying alive becomes an act of defiance, maintaining human dignity becomes a form of warfare, and small acts of kindness toward fellow prisoners become profound moral statements. This transformation of survival into resistance serves important psychological functions for prisoners who need to maintain some sense of agency and purpose. But it also serves the camp administration's interests by channeling resistance into individual rather than collective forms. Prisoners who are focused on personal survival are less likely to organize group resistance activities, and prisoners who find meaning in small acts of individual defiance are less likely to support systematic challenges to the camp's authority. By the time the fourth morning arrives, you understand something that couldn't have been communicated through any amount of description or explanation. The Gulag system is more than a prison or a work camp, or even a mechanism of political terror. It's a laboratory for studying the limits of human adaptability, a systematic exploration of how much can be taken from people before they cease to be recognizably human, and a machine for producing a specific type of survivor who has been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they can never again pose a threat to the system that created them. This realization comes not as an intellectual understanding, but as a felt knowledge, a recognition that you are no longer the person you were 4 days ago, and that the person you're becoming is someone you couldn't have imagined before entering this system. The camp has succeeded in its primary mission, not just to punish or extract labor, but to demonstrate that human nature itself is malleable, that dignity and resistance and hope are not innate characteristics, but learned behaviors that can be systematically unlearned through the application of sufficient pressure over sufficient time. The 4th day begins not with the clang of metal on metal, but with a different sound entirely. The wet, rattling cough of the man sleeping next to you. It's a sound you're learning to recognize, the particular rhythm that indicates lungs filling with fluid, the body's surrender to conditions that no human organism was designed to endure. By the time the official wake-up call comes, he's already gone, his body cooling in the space between you and the wall, and you feel nothing but a mild irritation that his death might delay the morning count. This absence of emotional response to death would have horrified the person you were less than a week ago. That person had normal human reactions to suffering, normal expectations about the value of human life, normal assumptions about the appropriate response to tragedy. But that person never had to calculate whether expressing grief might be interpreted as criticism of camp conditions, never had to consider whether helping a dying man might result in accusations of forming unauthorized associations, never had to weigh the caloric cost of emotional investment against the energy needed for another day of impossible labor. The guards who come to collect the body treat it as a routine administrative task, no different from repairing broken equipment or redistributing work assignments. They make notes on clipboards, update their records, and arrange for the corpse to be dragged to the camp's disposal area where it will be buried in an unmarked grave with dozens of others. The dead man's possessions, his spare shirt, his wooden spoon, his carefully hoarded piece of string, are redistributed among the surviving prisoners according to a hierarchy you're beginning to understand. Your work assignment today is the brick factory, where prisoners make building materials using clay, water, and human waste in proportions that have been calculated to produce bricks that are just strong enough to meet construction requirements while using the cheapest possible ingredients. The work involves standing in freezing mud for 12 hours, shaping bricks by hand, and carrying them to drying areas where they're stacked in patterns designed to maximize air circulation and minimize the time required for the moisture to evaporate. The brick factory reveals another dimension of the camp's systematic degradation, the way it forces prisoners to work with substances that destroy their health in ways that aren't immediately visible. The clay contains chemicals that cause skin lesions and respiratory problems that develop over months rather than days. The water used in brickmaking comes from sources contaminated with human waste and industrial runoff that cause gastrointestinal diseases that weaken prisoners gradually rather than killing them quickly. Most insidiously, the work requires prisoners to handle their own waste and the waste of fellow prisoners as a routine part of the production process. This isn't just about hygiene or health. It's about psychological conditioning. People who are forced to work with human waste learn to see themselves as waste, to accept degradation as normal, to abandon the kind of self-respect that might motivate resistance to the system that's degrading them. The other prisoners at the brick factory move with the same mechanical efficiency you've observed elsewhere. But here the efficiency serves a different purpose. Working quickly means less time in contact with toxic materials. Working skillfully means producing bricks that meet quality standards and reduce the likelihood of punishment for sabotage. Working cooperatively means sharing techniques that help everyone minimize exposure to the most dangerous aspects of the process. But cooperation at the brick factory also reveals the camp's genius for turning survival strategies into control mechanisms. Prisoners who share information about safe work techniques become dependent on each other in ways that make independent action more difficult. Prisoners who help each other avoid the worst aspects of the work become invested in maintaining the social relationships that make cooperation possible. The camp's informal economy transforms mutual aid into another form of bondage. The morning break brings an announcement that illustrates the arbitrary nature of camp justice. 3 prisoners from yesterday's lumber mill detail have been accused of sabotage because productivity fell below quota levels. The accused prisoners will receive reduced rations for a week and additional work assignments during their rest periods. There's no investigation, no opportunity for the accused to defend themselves, no evidence presented beyond the statistical fact that quotas weren't met. This announcement serves multiple purposes in the camp's control strategy. It demonstrates that failure to meet impossible standards will be punished regardless of the reasons for failure. It creates fear among prisoners who understand that they could be next. Most importantly, it reinforces the camp's fundamental message. Productivity is the only measure of prisoner value, and prisoners who don't produce enough value don't deserve to survive. You notice that your own response to this announcement has evolved since your first day. Instead of feeling outrage at the injustice or sympathy for the accused prisoners, you feel primarily anxiety about your own performance and relief that you weren't selected for punishment. This shift in focus from moral reasoning to survival calculation represents another step in the systematic destruction of the ethical framework that might otherwise motivate resistance to the camp's authority. The brick-making process itself becomes a meditation on the relationship between human dignity and productive labor. Each brick you shape represents hours of degrading work that produces something of genuine utility, buildings that will house people, walls that will provide shelter, structures that will outlast the prisoners who made them. But the utility of the final product doesn't ennoble the process of creating it. Instead, it highlights the camp's genius for extracting value from human suffering while making the extraction seem necessary and even beneficial. The midday meal at the brick factory is served in the same building where the work is performed, which means eating food while surrounded by the smell and sight of human waste, toxic clay, and industrial chemicals. This isn't just poor planning, it's deliberate conditioning designed to break down the psychological barriers that normally separate work life from personal life. Public behavior from private experience, acceptable conditions from unacceptable ones. The meal itself reveals new dimensions of the camp's nutrition strategy. Today's soup contains what appear to be vegetables, but closer examination reveals that they're actually weeds and grass that have been boiled to remove some of their toxicity, but retain their bulk. The bread contains a higher proportion of sawdust than usual, which makes it harder to digest, but creates the illusion of a more substantial meal. These substitutions aren't responses to food shortages. They're calculated decisions based on research into the minimum nutrition required to maintain worker productivity. You find yourself eating this mixture without complaint, not because you've developed a taste for industrial waste, but because complaining about food quality is classified as counter-revolutionary activity that results in punishment. More significantly, you've begun to evaluate food not in terms of palatability or nutritional value, but in terms of caloric content and digestive efficiency. Your relationship to eating has been transformed from a source of pleasure or comfort into a technical operation designed to fuel continued survival. The afternoon work shift introduces you to the brick factory's quality control system, which operates according to principles that would be familiar to any industrial engineer, but horrifying to anyone with normal human sensibilities. Bricks are tested by dropping them from specific heights and measuring the pattern of breakage. Bricks that break incorrectly indicate problems with the manufacturing process that must be corrected through increased supervision modified techniques, or punishment of the workers responsible for the defective products. This quality control system creates another layer of psychological pressure for prisoners who are already operating at the limits of their physical capacity. Every brick you make is potential evidence of sabotage if it fails to meet standards that have been set without regard for the conditions under which the work is performed. Every batch of bricks becomes a test that you might fail despite your best efforts, leading to punishment that will make tomorrow's work even more difficult. The testing process also serves as a demonstration of the camp's power to define reality according to its own needs. Bricks that would be considered acceptable in any normal construction project are classified as defective if they don't meet the camp's arbitrary standards. Work techniques that produce adequate results under normal circumstances are classified as sabotage if they don't produce optimal results under camp conditions. The camp's authority extends beyond controlling prisoners' bodies to controlling the meaning of their work. As the afternoon progresses, you begin to understand that the brick factory represents the Gulag system in microcosm, a place where human beings are systematically transformed into components of an industrial process, where individual survival depends on accepting degradation as normal, and where resistance is made virtually impossible through the combination of physical exhaustion, psychological pressure, and social fragmentation. The evening march back to camp takes you past a construction site where yesterday's bricks are being used to build new barracks. The sight of your own work being incorporated into the camp's infrastructure creates a complex psychological response that you're still learning to process. On one hand, there's a natural human satisfaction in seeing tangible results from your labor. On the other hand, there's the recognition that your work is helping to expand the very system that's destroying you. This contradiction between the normal human need to find meaning in productive work and the reality that your productivity serves your oppressors is another example of the camp's systematic assault on psychological coherence. Prisoners who take pride in their work are collaborating with their own oppression. Prisoners who refuse to work conscientiously face punishment that makes survival more difficult. The camp creates situations where every possible response to forced labor involves some form of moral compromise. Tonight's meal includes an announcement that affects the entire camp. Productivity levels across all work details have exceeded targets for the past week, and as a reward, prisoners will receive an additional piece of bread with tomorrow's breakfast. The announcement creates a surge of excitement that would be touching if it weren't so tragic. Desperate people celebrating a reward that represents perhaps 50 additional calories in a diet that provides less than half of what their bodies need to function normally. But the reward serves important functions in the camp's psychological warfare strategy. It creates the impression that the camp administration is fair and responsive to prisoner performance. It encourages prisoners to push themselves even harder in hopes of earning future rewards. Most importantly, it reinforces the camp's fundamental message. Prisoners who accept the system and work within it can earn improvements in their treatment, while prisoners who resist will only make their circumstances worse. The return to the barracks reveals that your sleeping assignment has been changed again, this time placing you in a section with prisoners who are suspected of planning resistance activities. This isn't punishment exactly, but it isn't random either. The camp administration uses sleeping assignments as a form of surveillance, placing potential troublemakers with prisoners who have incentives to report suspicious behavior. Your placement in this section might mean that you've been identified as a security risk, or it might mean that you're being tested to see whether you'll report on your new bunkmates. The prisoners in this section are different from the ones you've encountered previously. They speak more quietly, move more carefully, and maintain a level of alertness that suggests they understand they're being watched more closely than other prisoners. Some have been in the camp for years and have developed sophisticated strategies for surviving administrative suspicion. Others are newer arrivals who haven't yet learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicate increased surveillance. Your new bunkmate is a former army officer who was arrested for expressing doubt about Soviet military strategy. He's been in the camp for 8 months and has learned to navigate its systems with a combination of strategic thinking and careful compliance that's kept him alive while many others have died. His survival strategy involves appearing completely broken and compliant while maintaining enough mental clarity to make rational decisions about daily survival challenges. His advice, whispered during the brief period between lights out and the beginning of guard patrols, reveals the sophistication of the psychological game that long-term prisoners must master. Never let them think you're planning anything, but never stop planning. Never let them think you have hope, but never lose hope entirely. Never let them think you're strong, but never become actually weak. Never trust anyone completely, but never become completely isolated. These paradoxes represent the narrow space within which survival is possible in the Gulag system. Prisoners who lean too far in any direction, toward resistance or compliance, hope or despair, trust or isolation, create vulnerabilities that the camp administration can exploit. Successful survival requires maintaining a complex balance that would be psychologically exhausting under normal circumstances and becomes almost impossible under the constant stress of camp life. The night sounds in this section of the barracks include elements you haven't heard before. The careful whispers of prisoners sharing information about guard schedules, the subtle movements of prisoners checking for surveillance equipment, and the particular quality of silence that indicates people are thinking rather than sleeping. These sounds create an atmosphere of tension that makes rest even more difficult than usual, but they also suggest that human intelligence and dignity can survive even under these conditions. Your dreams on the fourth night are different again, now featuring detailed scenarios about brick-making techniques, calculations about caloric efficiency, and elaborate social strategies for navigating camp hierarchy. Your unconscious mind has fully adapted to camp reality, focusing entirely on problems that have practical solutions, rather than wasting energy on hopes or fears that can't be acted upon. This represents the completion of a psychological transformation that began with your arrest. You've become a person whose mental processes are entirely organized around the requirements of survival in an impossible system. The deep night hours bring a realization that's both liberating and terrifying. You no longer remember what it felt like to be the person you were before your arrest. That person's concerns, relationships, and identity have faded into something that feels like memories of a book you read long ago, rather than experiences you actually lived. The camp has succeeded in its mission of transformation so completely that you can no longer imagine returning to your previous life, even if escape were possible. This psychological death and rebirth is the Gulag's most profound achievement. Not just the destruction of individual prisoners, but the creation of a new type of human being who has been shaped by extreme conditions into something that serves the system's needs. You've become living proof that human nature is not fixed, that dignity and resistance are learned behaviors that can be unlearned, and that survival itself can become a form of collaboration with the forces that are destroying you. As the fifth morning approaches, you understand with perfect clarity why you wouldn't last a day in the Gulag. Not because you would die quickly, but because the person who might physically survive would no longer be you in any meaningful sense. The camp doesn't just kill prisoners. It transforms them into something else entirely, something that can function within the system, but can never again threaten it. Something that serves as a testament to the power of systematic oppression to remake human consciousness itself. The tragedy isn't just that people died in the camps, though millions did. The tragedy is that the people who survived were forever changed by the experience, carrying within them the knowledge that human beings can be broken and remade, that civilization is thinner than we imagine, and that the capacity for both cruelty and adaptation runs deeper than most people ever want to discover. They return to the world as walking proof of what human beings can do to each other, and what human beings can become when every assumption about dignity, justice, and meaning is systematically stripped away. The fifth morning brings no relief, no gradual adjustment to horror. only the deepening recognition that what you've experienced so far was merely the introduction to a system whose true depths you're only beginning to glimpse. The metal bar strikes its familiar rhythm against the railroad track, but now the sound carries different meaning. It's no longer a wake-up call, it's a countdown, marking another day subtracted from whatever remains of your life. Another step deeper into a transformation that has no clear endpoint, except the complete dissolution of whoever you used to be. Your body responds to the sound with mechanical precision now, muscles moving before consciousness fully engages, because you've learned that those first few seconds of wakefulness determine how much energy you'll have for the impossible day ahead. The man who died beside you has been replaced by someone new, a middle-aged factory worker from Tula, whose crime was making a joke about grain quotas during a workers' meeting. He's been in the system for 6 weeks, long enough to have lost the shocked disbelief of new arrivals, but not long enough to have developed the hollow-eyed efficiency of long-term survivors. You watch him struggle with his boots, fingers too numb and swollen to work the laces properly, and you recognize the signs. He's still fighting the system instead of flowing with it, still expecting his efforts to produce proportional results, still believing that competence and good intention might earn him some form of recognition or reward. In 2 weeks, if he survives that long, he'll understand what you're beginning to grasp. That the camp operates according to principles that have nothing to do with fairness, effort, or human logic. The morning count reveals that 3 more prisoners died during the night, their bodies arranged along the barracks wall like discarded equipment awaiting disposal. The guards note the deaths in their ledgers with the same attention they give to recording broken tools or depleted supplies. These aren't tragedies requiring investigation or explanation. They're statistical events that affect productivity calculations and resource allocation. The dead prisoners' rations will be redistributed among the survivors, creating a grotesque arithmetic where death becomes a source of marginal improvement for the living. Your work assignment today sends you to the camp's most dreaded detail, the punishment brigade, where prisoners who have committed infractions are sent to perform the kind of labor that the administration uses as both practical work and psychological torture. You haven't committed any infractions that you're aware of, but infractions in the Gulag system don't require actual violations of stated rules. They can be created retroactively to justify punishment, or assigned randomly to maintain the proper atmosphere of fear, or simply distributed according to administrative convenience when difficult work needs to be completed. The Punishment Brigade's current project involves digging drainage ditches through permanently frozen ground using hand tools that have been deliberately kept in poor repair. The worksite is located in a marsh several miles from the main camp, accessible only through terrain that becomes increasingly treacherous as the morning sun melts the surface ice just enough to create hidden pockets of freezing water. The march to the worksite becomes an endurance test in itself, with prisoners sinking knee-deep into mud that seems designed to extract every possible calorie from already depleted bodies. The tools provided for the drainage work consist of pickaxes with loose heads, shovels with cracked handles, and crowbars bent from previous use. The ground itself has the consistency of concrete, frozen solid to depths that make meaningful excavation virtually impossible using manual labor. Yet the quotas remain unchanged. Each prisoner must dig 6 cubic meters of ditch per day, regardless of soil conditions, tool quality, or physical capacity. The impossibility isn't accidental, it's the point. The Punishment Brigade includes prisoners from every category of camp hierarchy. Political prisoners accused of counter-revolutionary activity, criminal prisoners who violated internal camp rules, trustees who fell from favor with administrators, and ordinary prisoners whose only crime was being available when punishment assignments needed to be filled. This mixing of categories serves important psychological functions, breaking down the social structures that prisoners use to maintain identity and creating artificial conflicts that prevent unified resistance. Working alongside you is a former university professor who was accused of teaching bourgeois philosophy, a career criminal who was caught stealing from other prisoners, and a camp trustee who was demoted for showing excessive sympathy towards sick inmates. Under normal circumstances, these three men would have nothing in common and no reason to cooperate. But the punishment brigade creates a situation where survival depends on coordination, forcing prisoners with fundamentally different worldviews to work together while simultaneously ensuring they can never trust each other completely. The professor attempts to maintain his intellectual dignity by treating the work as a problem in engineering and logistics, calculating optimal digging angles and developing theories about soil composition that might make the task more efficient. The criminal focuses on identifying opportunities for personal advantage, noting which guards can be distracted and which tools might be stolen for trade purposes. The former trustee works with desperate intensity, hoping that exceptional effort might earn him restoration to his previous position of relative privilege. All three approaches fail, not because the men lack intelligence or determination, but because the system has been designed to make success impossible, regardless of strategy. The professor's calculations are irrelevant when the tools break during use. The criminal's opportunities for advantage disappear when guards rotate unpredictably. The trustee's exceptional effort goes unnoticed because the guards have been instructed to focus on punishment rather than performance. Each man's failure reinforces the other's despair, creating a cycle of mutual demoralization that serves the camp's interests perfectly. The morning break brings an announcement that several prisoners from the punishment brigade have been selected for extended sentences due to poor productivity. The selection appears random, but you're beginning to understand that randomness in the Gulag system is itself a form of control. When punishment is unpredictable, prisoners spend mental energy trying to identify patterns that don't exist, rather than developing coherent strategies for resistance or escape. The apparent arbitrariness of punishment makes the system more terrifying, not less, because it suggests that safety is impossible, regardless of behavior. You notice that your own psychological responses have evolved again since yesterday. Where you might once have felt fear at the prospect of arbitrary punishment, now you feel primarily a kind of analytical curiosity about the selection process. Where you might once have felt sympathy for the selected prisoners, now you feel relief that mathematical probability worked in your favor. This emotional numbness represents another stage in the systematic destruction of normal human responses that the camp is designed to accomplish. The work itself becomes a meditation on the relationship between human effort and meaningful accomplishment. Each swing of your pickaxe removes perhaps a few ounces of frozen earth, progress so minimal that it becomes almost abstract. Yet the quotas remain absolute. 6 cubic meters per day, measured and recorded with bureaucratic precision. The disconnect between the physical reality of the work and the administrative reality of the quotas creates a form of psychological torture that's more effective than physical violence, because it attacks the basic human need to see effort produce results. The other prisoners in your work detail have developed various coping strategies for managing this disconnect between effort and accomplishment. Some focus obsessively on technique, developing elaborate theories about optimal tool usage that provide the illusion of control over circumstances that are fundamentally beyond their influence. Others retreat into mental worlds entirely separate from their physical circumstances, conducting internal conversations with family members or reciting literature or mathematics problems that have nothing to do with ditch digging. The most successful prisoners, paradoxically, are the ones who have learned to find satisfaction in the work itself rather than in its results. They develop a kind of meditative relationship with the repetitive physical motions, focusing on the rhythm of swinging tools rather than on the minimal progress being made. This psychological adaptation allows them to avoid the despair that comes from constantly measuring their efforts against impossible quotas, but it also represents a form of surrender that makes resistance less likely. The midday meal consists of the same watery soup and sawdust bread, but today it's served at the worksite rather than in the camp dining area. This means eating while standing in freezing mud, surrounded by the tools and debris of forced labor, with no shelter from wind or precipitation. The meal becomes another form of degradation, another opportunity for the system to demonstrate that normal human comforts are privileges that must be earned rather than rights that can be expected. You find yourself eating mechanically without pleasure or even conscious attention because food has become purely functional, fuel for continued survival rather than a source of satisfaction or social connection. This transformation of eating from a human activity into an industrial process represents another step in the systematic reduction of prisoners from people into productive units. The camp succeeds in its mission not just by controlling prisoners' bodies, but by changing their relationship to the most basic human experiences. The afternoon work shift introduces a new element of psychological pressure. Competition between work teams based on productivity measurements that have been calculated to ensure that no team can succeed without another team failing. The system creates artificial scarcity of recognition and reward, forcing prisoners to see each other as obstacles to their own survival rather than as fellow victims of the same oppressive system. This competition serves multiple purposes. It increases overall productivity through fear-based motivation, prevents the formation of solidarity between prisoners, and channels resistance into internal conflicts rather than challenges to camp authority. Your team falls behind the required pace almost immediately, not because of lack of effort, but because the tools provided are even more inadequate than usual, and the ground is harder than previous days. The falling behind creates a cascade of psychological pressure that affects every prisoner in the detail. Some respond by working more frantically, exhausting themselves in pursuit of impossible quotas. Others begin looking for prisoners to blame for the team's poor performance. A few retreat into the kind of psychological withdrawal that indicates they've given up hope of meeting the requirements and are preparing for whatever punishment awaits. The guards supervising the work detail have learned to recognize these psychological patterns and to exploit them for maximum effect. They provide constant updates on team productivity levels, creating artificial urgency around metrics that have no relationship to actual work requirements. They rotate between encouragement and threats in ways designed to keep prisoners off balance and unable to develop consistent strategies for managing their circumstances. Most insidiously, they occasionally single out individual prisoners for praise or criticism in ways that create jealousy and resentment within work teams. As the afternoon progresses, you begin to understand that the punishment brigade represents the Gulag system's most sophisticated form of psychological warfare. The work is designed to be impossible, the tools are designed to fail, the quotas are designed to create despair, and the social dynamics are designed to prevent prisoners from supporting each other through the experience. Every aspect of the punishment brigade serves the larger goal of breaking prisoners down so completely that they lose the capacity for independent thought or resistance. The physical exhaustion created by impossible work quotas combines with psychological pressure from arbitrary punishment to create a state of consciousness that's neither fully awake nor fully unconscious. You find yourself moving through the workday in a kind of trance, aware of your circumstances but disconnected from emotional responses that might make those circumstances unbearable. This dissociation serves a protective function, allowing you to continue functioning despite conditions that would normally trigger complete psychological breakdown. But the dissociation also serves the camp's interests by creating prisoners who are compliant without being consciously collaborative, productive without being personally invested in their work, and present without being fully human. The punishment brigade produces a specific type of consciousness, aware enough to follow orders, numb enough to accept degradation, and isolated enough to avoid forming bonds that might support resistance activities. The evening march back to camp takes you past other work details returning from their assignments. And you notice that the punishment brigade prisoners are treated differently by guards and administrators. Not more harshly, necessarily, but with a particular kind of attention that suggests they're being studied rather than simply supervised. You realize that the punishment brigade isn't just about completing specific work projects. It's about testing the limits of human adaptation, exploring how much can be taken from people before they cease to function entirely. The evening meal brings news that affects your understanding of the camp's larger purpose. Production targets for all work details have been increased by 20%, not because of changes in external demand for camp products, but because recent improvements in prisoner morale and work capacity have made higher productivity levels achievable. The announcement reveals that the camp administration views prisoner adaptation not as human resilience to be respected, but as industrial capacity to be exploited more efficiently. This perspective on prisoner adaptation illuminates the true genius of the Gulag system. It's not just designed to punish or extract labor, but to study the process by which human beings can be systematically transformed into more efficient, productive units. Every survival strategy that prisoners develop becomes information that can be used to make the system more effective at extracting value from future prisoners. Every form of resistance that's overcome becomes a model for overcoming future resistance. Every psychological adaptation that allows survival becomes evidence that the system can push human beings even further without losing their productive capacity. Tonight's return to the barracks reveals that your sleeping assignment has been changed yet again, this time placing you with prisoners who are known to be informants. This isn't subtle. It's a clear message that your behavior is being monitored more closely, and that future survival depends on demonstrating absolute loyalty to camp authority. The placement with informants serves multiple functions. It provides direct surveillance of your activities and conversations. It tests your willingness to provide information about fellow prisoners, and it isolates you from prisoners who might offer genuine support or solidarity. The informants themselves represent another dimension of the camp's systematic destruction of human relationships. They're not evil people who enjoy betraying others. They're desperate individuals who have learned that providing information about fellow prisoners is one of the few ways to earn marginal improvements in treatment. Their collaboration with camp authority isn't based on ideological support for the Soviet system, but on rational calculations about personal survival in circumstances where normal moral reasoning has become impossible. Your new bunkmates include a former party member who provides reports on prisoners who express doubt about Soviet policies, a common criminal who informs on prisoners who violate camp rules, and a trustee who reports on prisoners who show signs of planning resistance activities. Each has developed a different relationship with the informant role. The party member maintains that he's serving Soviet interests, the criminal treats it as a business transaction, and the trustee has convinced himself that preventing resistance activities protects fellow prisoners from severe punishment. Their conversations, conducted in whispers that you're clearly meant to overhear, reveal the psychological sophistication of the camp's surveillance system. They don't discuss specific prisoners or particular pieces of information. Instead, they share general observations about behavioral patterns, work performance, and social relationships that allow camp administrators to identify potential problems before they develop into actual resistance activities. This predictive approach to surveillance makes overt rebellion virtually impossible because troublemakers can be identified and neutralized before they act. The night sounds in this section of the barracks are different from previous areas. Quieter, more controlled, filled with the particular tension that comes from people who are constantly performing rather than simply existing. Every conversation is potential intelligence. Every relationship is potentially useful or dangerous, and every emotional response is evaluated for its implications regarding loyalty and reliability. The atmosphere creates a form of psychological exhaustion that's separate from physical fatigue. The constant stress of monitoring your own behavior for signs that might be misinterpreted or reported. Sleep brings dreams that are now entirely focused on immediate survival challenges. Memorizing guard schedules, calculating food distribution patterns, and developing strategies for avoiding punishment assignments. Your unconscious mind has adapted completely to camp reality, abandoning any connection to your previous life or identity. This represents the completion of the psychological transformation that the Gulag system is designed to accomplish. The creation of a consciousness that exists entirely within the camp's reality and serves entirely the camp's purposes. The deep night hours bring a final realization that settles into your bones with the same permanence as the cold. You will never leave this place, not because your sentence is indefinite, but because the person who might physically leave would no longer be capable of existing outside the camp's reality. The system has succeeded so completely in its mission of transformation that you can no longer imagine wanting to return to a world where choices matter, where effort produces proportional results, where human relationships are based on affection rather than survival calculations. This is the Gulag's ultimate victory. Not the destruction of individual prisoners, but the creation of people who are so perfectly adapted to impossible circumstances that they can no longer conceive of circumstances that might be different. You've become living proof that human consciousness is infinitely malleable, that dignity and hope and resistance are learned behaviors that can be systematically unlearned, and that survival itself can become a form of collaboration with the forces that are destroying everything you once believed made life worth living. And so, as dawn approaches, on what you no longer think of as your sixth day, but simply as another day, in the only reality you can now imagine, you understand with absolute clarity why you wouldn't last a day in the Gulag. Not because the system would kill you, though it might, but because it would do something far more thorough and far more permanent. It would transform you so completely that death would become irrelevant, because the person you had been would already be gone, replaced by something that serves the system's needs so perfectly that it can no longer remember ever wanting to serve anything else. The Gulag didn't just imprison bodies, it colonized souls, creating a population of survivors who carried the system's logic within them forever, walking testimonies to the power of systematic oppression to remake human nature itself. And in that remaking, it achieved something far more profound than mere punishment. It demonstrated that the line between victim and collaborator, between resistance and compliance, between humanity and its absence, is not fixed, but fluid, subject to conditions that can transform anyone into anything, given sufficient time, sufficient pressure, and sufficient understanding of how consciousness itself can be dismantled and rebuilt to serve purposes its original owner could never have imagined. Sleep now, if you can. Rest in the knowledge that your warm bed, your full stomach, your freedom to dream of tomorrow. These are not inevitabilities, but gifts, fragile and precious beyond measure. And remember, as you drift off to more gentle dreams, that the capacity for both cruelty and adaptation runs deeper in human nature than most of us ever want to discover.